Hey everyone, CJ here, bringing you another episode of Open the World Map. This time we will be talking to Andy Kitkowski, who is based in Japan. He is a translator of Japanese tabletop RPGs, including one of my top favorites, Ryutama. In this interview, we talked about the TRPG scene in Japan, the three-way battle between Dungeons & Dragons, Pathfinder, and Sword World 2.5, and more. Thanks for joining us, Andy. You have translated Ryutama, which is one of my favorite RPGs there is. That's not D&D, and I think it's really great.
Yeah.
It just treats adventuring in a really different way. But today, I think we want to ask a few sort of like a starter question regarding D&D in Japan, because Japan have their own tabletop RPGs, and do people play D&D there? Is it popular?
So a couple things. D&D was the first RPG brought into Japan back in the 80s, mid 80s. And it's always had a stable fan base, even though other games came out and became more popular at times. So after Dungeons and Dragons came out, there was a few years later not a knockoff by any means, but it was definitely a game written more for a Japanese audience. Sword World came out. And Sword World, unlike D&D, used only 2d6 dice, d6 dice, which you can find anywhere in Japan. Like Yakuza use them for gambling, but you can't find all the weird polyhedral dice unless you were a student living in Tokyo and knew like one of the two stores that could import them in the 80s. So games with different polyhedral dice weren't quite as popular early on. So Sword World was a big thing. Cut to many years later, every version of D&D had come out in Japanese, but usually there was a game that was a little more popular at the time. But now we're in an interesting time because within the last 6 to 8 months alone, 3 fantasy behemoths rolled through Japan. First was Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, came out in Japanese. Sword World 2.5, the revised edition of Sword World 2.0, came out just a few weeks ago. And also just a few weeks ago, Pathfinder, the Japanese release of Pathfinder release. So now we've got 3 behemoth fantasy games all sort of competing for mind space. The biggest, hands down, the biggest played RPG in Japan these days, let's say for the last 8 years or so, consistently, is Call of Cthulhu, interestingly enough. Unlike every other market on the planet, Call of Cthulhu, where you think role-playing game equals Dungeons and Dragons in many other countries, in Japan for the last few years, role-playing equals Call of Cthulhu. It's been a really interesting market. But beyond that, after that, Sword World has the prime mental real estate in Japan. But Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition is going strong. There are lots of I sometimes go to gaming cafes and stuff like that, and there's always D&D 5th edition and some 4th edition tables going down. There are Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition conventions, like local conventions with just a few tables and stuff, but like there'd be one in Yokohama or one in Tokyo where there'd be like 10 tables of just Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition.
Right. Okay, that's interesting. Do they play Adventurers League? Is it like an organized play thing, or do they just do it themselves? Just have private tables playing?
Yeah, do it themselves. Basically, it's not I don't know what the state of like the RPGA and stuff like that is. Way back in the day when I used to go to Gen Con, back when it was in Milwaukee and stuff like that, you used to have to all the tables would be full, and the only way you can get into game is to join the RPGA, and they would have all those living events and stuff like that. I don't think I've seen a blogger post or two about living events, but it's usually just there's foreigners also, gaijin in Japan, in the gaijin community here. Unlike the Japanese community, Dungeons and Dragons is the strongest played game, but and there's been there's like a person or two, I guess, that was involved in those living style games before, or the official living campaign games, so they're looking to start up something. But in Japan, it's not so much the living games. There's not that level of organization here. It's mostly just tables of people running simple adventures, homebrew adventures, stuff like that.
I want to ask you a bit about like the form factor. I got a friend who bought me a RPG book, Japanese RPG book. It's a Log
Mhm.
Horizon book. This is the size of the book compared to a fifth edition book. So it's
Mhm.
obviously smaller. I guess it's half the size.
Yep.
And do you think it would actually help Dungeons and Dragons if they actually publish the book in this smaller form rather than this really large form?
Yeah, well, there's all sorts of choices that are made with these things. Like, for example, yeah, I'll here's my Japanese edition of Dungeons and Dragons, which is it is the same size as the a paper size as the U.S. version. Versus here's the game which is not as thick as, but it's the same size as Log Horizon. This one's called Draco Rouge. So you can see by comparison, it is basically a large manga format in size, and then here is the classic bunko size. This is the size of novels and stuff like that. Like for example, my copy of Dune comes in like three of these size of books. So this is the form factor of most classic Japanese literature. And then when RPGs first start, like when original Japanese RPGs first came out and started being put into bookstores, it was book publishers that did them. So it came out in this form factor. I have a mixed relationship with it. I love certain aspects of it, but like for example, it's inexpensive. Um, you can get them in normal bookstores. Like something like this, you can order it from any bookstore, but you wouldn't see it at a bookstore because it just takes up so much shelf space. There's really nothing else it can fit next to. Um, but something like this can fit on shelves. It's also you can fit in your. It can easily be fit into your pocket. The text is it's hard to describe, but it's a little bit the font is kind of small, but it's not that big a deal. The only thing is that these tend to be extremely sparse when it comes to art. So if you have a game that art is not needed to bring you into the world, and you just want to kind of convey the rules, and like otherwise just a few character sketches and the players will get it, then a game like this is no problem to have like that. There's only maybe out of this entire book, there's like one character illustration for each major character class, maybe a few pieces like this, and then like just a few monster illustrations. So maybe less than 15 illustrations in this entire book. Um, but they were able to do that. But if you wanted to something that really conveyed like French style, like if you've seen French RPGs that are beautiful full color things, something that really pulls you in, you really have to go for something bigger with higher quality. Things like the Dungeons Dragons or the Call of Cthulhu's or the Eclipse Phase style. So it's basically like there's a lot of choices that are made in that sort of thing. Like you know, especially if they're translating a foreign book into an English market. Um, a lot of people in Japan are buying that because they are interested in seeing the game in its sort of native format. So if you had a game like this, but then you reduced it to a black and white small book, people are like, well, yeah, I can play it, but it doesn't feel like Dungeons and Dragons. It doesn't feel like that giant foreign game that is sweeping the world. Um, uh, so yeah, there's a little bit of Meanwhile, if a new game is coming out, again, if they have a very distinct, unique setting and they're planning on doing a lot of art, they might have a slightly larger like this or larger form factor like Log Horizon. Uh, but if they're doing it like if it's sort of we want to make it as cheap as possible to make their to have fewest points of entry or barriers to entry, then they'd make it the smaller format.
With all these games coming out, I don't know much about Sword World besides there is a new version 2.5. I don't know how different it is from 2, but then again, I don't know much about 2 either. But I think in general, do you think there is an actual competition between this three different games, or do they?
A little bit, yeah. So ultimately, there's not a the companies that publish these games are all sort of they all actually fall, if I'm not mistaken, I think they all fall under the same Zaibatsu. They're all somehow related to or under Kadokawa Publishing, if I'm not mistaken. um, I'd have to look up the details. I know that most of these are, even though that they're different sub companies, but they all go. all these small companies go into Enterbrain, and Enterbrain is now owned by Kadokawa. So they're all sort of like branches. So there's not like fighting competition between the two. It's more like friendly competition. But still, having said that, and I'll be honest, a lot of my Japanese friends who are like heavy players have played lots of D&D and have played lots of Sword World. When D&D was coming out, they went to 2 or 3 Dungeons and Dragons events. When Sword World 2.5 came out, they were first in line to buy Sword World, and they played in several events like that. So it's not like sort of like a ride or die with one game, one release only. Most people will play, at least try a few sessions of the other game. But having said that, there's limited amount of time in human, in a human day. So they are sort of competing for mind space. So yeah, they're in a little bit of competition with each other. I was mentioning how like the kind of the old school games like RuneQuest, which is coming out in a new release and stuff like that, where there's kind of a certain mindset and player style for those games versus the newer games. I wouldn't say that there's like, there are Sword World types and there are Dungeons and Dragons types, and then it's not like that, but there is a little bit of something like people who are just want to. I guess a part of it is Sword World doesn't use like grids and maps, so there's it's a lot more theater of the mind. You don't necessarily have miniatures and stuff like that. So it's very simple to get up and run, and with that, the rules are a little bit more simple, so you can there's a lot more focus on role playing and character. Dungeons and Dragons is more if you really want, if you really crave the sort of a little bit more gritty combat. Now, of course, 5th edition isn't like 4th edition, and 4th edition was pretty successful in Japan too. Yeah. So 5th edition doesn't necessarily have you can use the grids and stuff like that, and a lot of people do. But there are even times, and I'm very story focused games fanatic, but even there's sometimes where I'm like, you know what, I want to have something that has mechanical crunch to it for a little while, so I'll get into a big D&D phase and play a campaign of that, and then I'll roll back to something else like Sword World. They're a little bit competitive. I mean, they're in competition for people's headspaces, but the companies aren't really aggressively going after each other, and the players too. Honestly, it's like they'll play one thing for a couple sessions and another thing for a couple sessions, and it's all driven by which of their friends is going to GM and which of the campaign sounds the most interesting.
I think what you're saying is right. In the end, it's a matter of community, isn't it? It's like whether you can, there is an existing community for a certain game, and also how much it is part of the culture, I guess. And it's like in, I guess in the rest of the English speaking world, there is like something like a Critical Role or other like big shows like Penny Arcade's Acquisitions Incorporated. It gives them quite a lot of like sort of point of reference, how to play the game and things like that.
There's that in that's actually had that in Japan, even more so from the start with replays. The replay being a text version of like a text drop or a basically like that looks like a transcript or like a in a term of like a theatrical play of someone's actual session. In fact, yeah, it's like this is Sword World 2.5. This is a Sword World 2.0 replay that I picked up at a used bookstore for like 100 yen. But in it, there's a couple pictures to set the state. Here's the player characters that are involved, and it has a couple like light illustrations here and there. But for the most part, it's like here's the GM, and the GM says their line like in character as the GM, and then Anselm, the dwarf or whatever, speaks their line, and then Platina, the the elf druid, so it basically goes like that throughout the and by reading it, you get a sense, like people get a sense of what role playing is, and since this is actual session, so it's not like fabricated by someone and just people just lying about what they said. The kind of like Critical Role, in how they have like famous people, like I think this week they had Terry Crews. Wow, I haven't seen that yet. I'm totally going to see that. I love Terry Crews. But they'll actually have famous, quote unquote famous illustrators or game designers, or the author will actually participate in the game, and you get a sense of how they are as a player. and everyone's kind of on their best behavior. They want to make the game fun. They know it's going to be recorded later for transcription, so everyone's kind of bringing their A game to the table, right? So ultimately, the session is fun and it reads fun. So in a light novel like this, you can read what a session is like and understand, if you never experienced role playing before, what it is, how it works, and what a good session looks like. You don't have to stumble through like 10 crappy sessions with your, elementary school friends because no one taught you how to play, like your brother or sister showed you once and kicked you out of the room or whatever. A lot of people, like a surprising number of people, in fact, most of my friends who are now game designers in Japan, like including the author of Sword World, were introduced to the hobby by accidentally stumbling across a replay book. They picked it up. They're like, what the hell is this? This actually looks fun. I don't know what's going on here, but I'm going to go ahead and buy this book and make my friends play it. So that's been a huge thing. And then, of course, recently, in the more recent years, about 10 years ago, on Nico Nico Doga or YouTube, people transcribed sessions just like this, used Vocaloids to read the words, the lines out. And because of that, the one that the game that had that done to it the most was Call of Cthulhu. And that's what dragged an entire new generation. Like I would say Critical Role in the US, there's so many people, when I look in the gaijin communities in Japan, there are a lot of people who have never played D&D before, but really want to. But like when I run a session or something like that, they're like, "I've never played D&D. I've always wanted to play. I've heard about this. Oh, where'd you hear it from? Critical Role. Okay, cool. Come on, and what it's like." That 10 years ago in Japan was these Call of Cthulhu replay, like video replays, and that dragged an entire generation of young, eager Call of Cthulhu players. High school kids that were they were surfing YouTube on their phone on the way home and came across one of these videos and again went, "What the hell is this? This looks awesome. I want to try this." To like, there's now also a lot of women designers and scenario writers that were inspired by these videos, and like conventions that have a selling area now have like a lot of up and coming women designers and authors that are creating Call of Cthulhu scenarios.
With Call of Cthulhu, I do feel that somehow it is more female friendly. When I like advertise a game of Call of Cthulhu, I seem to get more female players than Dungeons and Dragons. I guess it's do you think it has more to do with their lack of focus on the combat or the mystery or things like that?
It could be, because that phenomenon is in Japan too. With Sword World and Dungeons and Dragons, well, I know a lot of women that play, and when I go to like a game cafe, especially for Sword World, I see like usually about 30 to 40% of the tables are women. But Call of Cthulhu is usually half or more, and I don't know. There's so many. There's probably like 100 reasons that are all solidified for that, and likely the same reasons for it in English are the same in Japanese. Particularly, for example, like the lack of abject female sexualization. So women looking at it are don't see the hugely brawny, fully armored warrior next to the bikini wearing wizard chick. They usually, everyone is equally doomed in Call of Cthulhu. And again, like a lot of the replays have focused on the role playing aspect. Everyone knows they're doomed is all like having fun while they succumb, and that seems to draw all sorts of interesting people to that sort of play style.